The CIA's MK Ultras. They literally experimented on American citizens and got away with it. Let's start with the one that makes every other conspiracy theory feel embarrassingly understated by comparison. For roughly 20 years, from the early 1950s through the 1970s, the Central Intelligence Agency ran a program called MK Ultra, a covert research initiative designed to develop mind control techniques through the use of drugs, hypnosis, psychological torture, and what the documents politely describe as behavioral modification. The subjects? American citizens. Many of them had no idea they were part of an experiment. The CIA dosed prisoners, mental patients, soldiers, and ordinary civilians with LSD without their knowledge or consent. They hired prostitutes to lure men into safe houses equipped with one-way mirrors, then observed their reactions to psychedelic drugs from behind the glass. They conducted experiments on children. They worked with hospitals and universities who received CIA funding and ran the research without their patients' consent. A man named Frank Olson, a CIA scientist, was dosed with LSD without his knowledge at a work retreat in 1953. Days later, he fell from a 13th floor window in New York. The government called it suicide. His family called it something else. In 1994, his body was exhumed. The forensic evidence suggested he had been knocked unconscious before going through the window. The case was never prosecuted. When a Senate committee investigated MK Ultra in 1977, the CIA director at the time admitted the program had existed, but explained that most of the documents had been destroyed in 1973 on the orders of the previous director. The files that survived were discovered only because they had been misfiled in a records room that wasn't searched. The program ran for 2 decades, involved at least 150 separately funded research projects, and the only reason anyone knows about it at all is because a government archivist put a box in the wrong cabinet. No charges were ever filed. No one went to prison. The Senate held hearings. The CIA issued statements. The files that were destroyed stayed destroyed. And American tax dollars had funded all of it. MW6 and the death of Georgy Markov, an umbrella that killed a man. In September 1978, a Bulgarian dissident named Georgy Markov was standing at a bus stop on Waterloo Bridge in London when he felt a sharp sting in the back of his right thigh. He turned around and saw a man picking up an umbrella. The man apologized, hailed a taxi, and disappeared. 3 days later, Markov was dead. The autopsy found a tiny platinum pellet, 1.7 millimeters in diameter, embedded in his leg. The pellet had 2 tiny holes drilled into it. Those holes had contained ricin, one of the most lethal poisons known to exist. The weapon was an umbrella modified to fire the pellet using a compressed gas mechanism. It was later determined to have been developed by the KGB and provided to the Bulgarian secret police. British intelligence, specifically MW6, had known that Markov and other Bulgarian dissidents living in London were at serious risk. They had received warnings. They had not acted on them with any urgency. After the murder, MI6 and Scotland Yard investigated. The Bulgarian agents responsible were identified. Bulgaria refused extradition. The KGB officer believed to have provided the weapon was identified decades later. No one was ever prosecuted in any jurisdiction. The umbrella that killed Georgy Markov is currently on display at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. The people who made it have never faced consequences. The case is technically still open. The Mossad and Operation Wrath of God. When Israel hunted across 3 continents after, Palestinian terrorists killed 11 Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympics. The Israeli government made a quiet decision. They would find every person responsible and kill them, not arrest them, not extradite, kill them, wherever they were, for as long as it took. The operation, later known as Wrath of God, ran for roughly 2 decades. Mossad teams tracked suspects across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, assassinating them one by one through a combination of letter bombs, car bombs, direct shootings, and, in at least one case, a very unfortunate accident involving a balcony. There was an error. In Lillehammer, Norway, in 1973, a Mossad team killed a Moroccan waiter named Ahmed Bouchiki, who had absolutely no connection to the Munich massacre and was simply the wrong man. Several Mossad agents were arrested by Norwegian police, the only time in the operation's history that any of its operatives faced actual legal consequences. They were convicted, sentenced, and then quietly released after serving brief portions of their sentences while Israeli diplomatic pressure mounted on Oslo. The operation itself has never been officially acknowledged by Israel. It was portrayed in Steven Spielberg's film Munich, which the Israeli government neither confirmed nor denied. The operatives involved have never been publicly identified by the Israeli state. The program either concluded in the early 1990s or is still ongoing, depending on which former intelligence officer you're reading on any given Tuesday. The NKVD's Great Purge, Stalin's intelligence service, devoured its own. The Soviet Union's NKVD under Stalin didn't just operate above the law. For several years in the late 1930s, the NKVD essentially was the law, and it used that position to execute approximately 750,000 people, send millions more to labor camps, and, in an act of institutional self destruction so extreme it borders on dark comedy, arrest and execute a substantial percentage of its own officers. NKVD Chief Genrikh Yagoda, who helped design and run the Great Purge, was himself arrested in 1937 and shot in 1938. His successor, Nikolai Yezhov, ran an even more frenzied wave of executions before being himself arrested in 1938 and shot in 1940. The period of his command is known in Russian historical memory as the Yezhovshchina, the Yezhov era, and the man was subsequently erased from official photographs using early Soviet airbrushing techniques that are now studied by historians as some of the first systematic uses of image manipulation for political purposes. The NKVD operated with troikas, committees of 3 officers who could sentence a person to death in minutes, without trial, without defense, without appeal. Quotas were issued to regional offices specifying how many people needed to be arrested and how many needed to be executed. When regional officers ran out of genuine suspects, they invented them. Neighbors denounced neighbors. Colleagues denounced colleagues. People were shot for jokes. People were shot for not reporting jokes. No one who ran the Great Purge was ever prosecuted in any meaningful sense. The men who survived it were eventually rehabilitated as post-Stalinist Soviet leadership quietly rewrote the record, blamed the dead Yezhov for everything, and moved on. The CIA in Iran, 1953. They overthrew a democracy and blamed a communist. In 1953, the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossad, made the catastrophic mistake of nationalizing the Iranian oil industry, which had been controlled by the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Britain was furious. The British government approached the CIA with a proposal: help us remove him. The CIA's operation, codenamed TPA-JAX, and the British equivalent, Operation Boot, organized street protests, bribed Iranian military officers, planted newspaper stories, and funded mobs to create the appearance of popular opposition to Mossad's government. When the plan initially failed, the Shah fled the country in panic. The CIA station chief, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, personally managed a second attempt days later. This one worked. Mossad was arrested. The Shah returned. A monarchy was restored. Oil profits flowed back to British and American companies. The CIA didn't formally acknowledge its role in the coup until 2013, 60 years later. The consequences were not minor. The resentment generated by the overthrow of Iran's democratic government contributed directly to the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the hostage crisis, and roughly 70 years of extraordinarily complicated relations between Iran and the West. The operation cost approximately $100,000 in bribes. 60 years of geopolitical consequences. No one involved was ever charged with anything. Kermit Roosevelt Jr. wrote a memoir about it called Countercoup. He was quite proud. The KGB's Sword and Shield, the spy agency that ran an entire country. The KGB at its peak was not merely an intelligence agency. It was a state within a state, employing somewhere between 480,000 and 700,000 full-time officers, not counting its network of informants, which conservative estimates place at approximately 5 million people in the Soviet Union alone. 1 in every 30 Soviet citizens was reporting on their neighbors. The KGB ran active operations on every continent. It cultivated spies inside the CIA, MI6, the Pentagon, the British Foreign Office, the French intelligence services, and the Vatican. It ran active measures, influence campaigns, disinformation programs, forgeries against Western governments on an industrial scale. It operated assassination units, sabotage units, and a dedicated department tasked with defaming and discrediting foreign leaders. It also operated an internal economy. KGB officers lived better than ordinary Soviet citizens. They had access to special stores, better housing, better medical care. The agency recruited from the best universities, trained its officers exhaustively, and created a culture of absolute loyalty that persisted long after the Soviet Union's collapse, which may explain why a former KGB officer currently has a private army, a nuclear arsenal, and a seat on the United Nations Security Council. The KGB was formally dissolved in 1991. Its successor agencies, the FSB, the SVR, and several others, inherited its personnel, its files, its infrastructure, and its institutional culture. The organization changed its name. Essentially, nothing else did. The Stasi, when an entire nation spied on itself East Germany's Ministry for State Security, known universally as the Stasi, achieved something that no intelligence agency before or since has quite matched: the comprehensive, paranoid, meticulously documented surveillance of an entire population by itself. At its peak, the Stasi employed approximately 91,000 full-time officers for a country of 16 million people, a ratio of one officer for every 63 citizens. Including part-time informants, the ratio drops to somewhere between 1 in 6 and 1 in 30, depending on the methodology. The Stasi maintained files on roughly 1 in 3 East Germans. These files were extraordinary objects. They recorded not just political activities and associations, but personal habits, sexual behavior, family dynamics, medical history, and interpersonal conflicts. The Stasi recruited informants from every layer of society, including therapists who reported on their patients, priests who reported on their congregations, and spouses who reported on each other. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Stasi officers spent weeks frantically shredding files. They shredded so much material so quickly that they broke their industrial shredding machines and had to resort to tearing documents by hand. They generated approximately 45 million pieces of torn paper. German archivists have spent decades reassembling them. Approximately 400 of the estimated 16,000 torn bags have been reconstructed so far. After reunification, some Stasi officers were prosecuted. Most were not. Many received pensions from the unified German government. The head of the Stasi, Erich Mielke, was tried, not for his decades of running a surveillance state, but for the 1931 murder of 2 police officers. He was convicted. He was 84 years old. He served 2 years and was released on grounds of old age. The CIA in Chile, 1973. Another democracy, another coup. 20 years after Iran, the pattern repeated. Salvador Allende was the democratically elected president of Chile and a socialist. The Nixon administration, led by National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, viewed him as an unacceptable communist influence in South America. The CIA ran a sustained campaign to destabilize Chile's economy, fund opposition media, and encourage military officers to stage a coup. On September 11th, 1973, a date that carries different meanings in different countries, General Augusto Pinochet seized power. Allende died in the presidential palace under circumstances that were officially ruled suicide and have never been entirely settled. Under Pinochet, approximately 3,000 Chileans were killed, 30,000 were tortured, and 200,000 were driven into exile. The CIA's role in creating the conditions for the coup was documented in congressional investigations throughout the 1970s. A CIA director publicly stated that the agency had destabilized Chile. Henry Kissinger was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973, the same year as the coup, for his role in negotiating the Paris Peace Accords, ending the Vietnam War. He died in November 2023 at the age of 100, never having been formally charged with anything related to Chile, Cambodia, or any of the other operations conducted under his direction. Chilean courts issued arrest warrants. No extradition was ever processed. GCHQ and the NSA, they were reading everyone's emails before anyone asked permission. In 2013, a 29-year-old NSA contractor named Edward Snowden copied thousands of classified documents onto a USB drive, flew to Hong Kong, and handed them to journalists. What those documents described was a surveillance architecture so vast that even the intelligence officials defending it seemed slightly surprised by how much they apparently did. The ENSA's PRISM program collected communications data directly from the servers of Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, and Yahoo. The X-key score system allowed analysts to search the full content of emails, browser history, and social media activity for virtually any internet user on Earth. The British equivalent, GCHQ's Tempora program, had tapped directly into fiber optic cables running under the Atlantic Ocean and was collecting enormous volumes of internet traffic as it passed through British territory. None of this collection had been explicitly authorized by the broad public through democratic processes. Specific legal frameworks had been interpreted, bent, and stretched to permit it. But the process by which those interpretations were reached was itself classified. The court that reviewed the programs was classified. The legal reasoning supporting the programs was classified. Snowden was charged under the Espionage Act. He has lived in Russia since 2013. The NSA programs he revealed were subsequently ruled illegal by a federal court. Several were modified or discontinued. The intelligence agencies involved were restructured slightly around the edges. The capability to collect the data largely remained. The people who had authorized the illegal programs were not prosecuted. The ISI and the Taliban, when an intelligence agency creates its own enemy. Pakistan's inter-services intelligence has, throughout its history, maintained relationships with militant organizations that its government simultaneously described as enemies, sometimes in the same press briefing. The ISI's support for the Afghan Mujahideen during the Soviet-Afghan War was conducted with American support and CIA funding, Operation Cyclone, and resulted in the defeat of the Soviet military in Afghanistan. It also resulted in the creation of the institutional networks, training infrastructure, and ideological framework that eventually became the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. This outcome was not entirely unforeseen by the people funding it. It was simply regarded as someone else's problem to handle after the Soviets left. The ISI's ongoing relationships with various militant factions have been documented extensively by American military officials, Indian intelligence, and Afghan governments, all of whom have noted the peculiar tendency of Pakistani military operations against militants to be effective, except when the militants in question were particularly useful to Pakistani strategic interests. After the 2011 killing of Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, a military garrison town, a short walk from Pakistan's preeminent military academy, the ISI's claim to have had no knowledge of his presence was received with widespread international skepticism that it has never fully recovered from. No ESI official has ever been prosecuted in connection with any of these activities. The agency continues to operate. Pakistan continues to receive billions in foreign aid from the United States, a country that lists Pakistan simultaneously as a major non-NATO ally and a state whose intelligence service maintains relationships with organizations responsible for American military casualties. This situation has persisted for approximately 40 years. The CIA's Air America, running a secret airline during a secret war. During the Vietnam War era, the CIA operated its own airline, not metaphorically. An actual airline with actual planes, actual pilots, and actual cargo, some of which, according to multiple investigations, congressional testimonies, and the memoir of a DEA agent named Michael Levine, included heroin from the Golden Triangle region of Southeast Asia. Air America officially transported supplies, personnel, and humanitarian aid in support of CIA operations in Laos, operations that Congress had not fully authorized and the American public was not fully informed about. The airline flew in a country where America was not officially at war, supporting a military campaign that was officially not happening, funded partly through mechanisms that were never entirely transparent. The heroin allegations were investigated and disputed. What was not disputed was that the CIA's airline flew in regions where the agency's allied commanders in Laos ran significant portions of the regional drug trade, that the CIA was aware of this, and that operational necessity was considered more important than drug enforcement. The DEA and the CIA had direct conflicts over the matter during this period. the DEA lost those conflicts. Air America was officially dissolved in 1976. Several of its functions were transferred to other entities. The Laotian operation it supported, the Secret War, is now acknowledged. The full financial accounting of how it was funded has never been made public. The Five Eyes, the alliance that watches everything and answers to no one. In the years after World War II, the intelligence agencies of the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand formed an alliance called the UKUSA Agreement, now known informally as the Five Eyes. The agreement enabled the five countries to share intelligence with each other freely, divide global surveillance responsibilities geographically, and access each other's collection capabilities. It also created a convenient legal workaround. Many democratic countries have laws prohibiting their intelligence agencies from spying on their own citizens without warrants. The Five Eyes arrangement meant that if you wanted information on a British citizen, you could simply ask the Americans to collect it, and vice versa. Each country was technically spying on foreign citizens, which was permitted. The fact that those foreign citizens happened to be the Allies' own people was, depending on your interpretation of the word technically, not technically a problem. The existence of the Five Eyes arrangement was not publicly confirmed by any of its member governments until 2010, when the New Zealand government acknowledged it. The alliance had been in continuous operation for over 60 years at that point. Its specific collection programs, budget, and operational scope remain classified. Based on the Snowden documents, its reach includes the ability to surveil the communications of virtually any person on Earth with an internet connection or a mobile phone. No legislative body in any of the five countries has full oversight of its operations. No court has ever reviewed its collective activities in their entirety. RAW and the creation of Bangladesh. When spying splits a country India's research and analysis wing, RAW was established in 1968 and within 3 years had helped engineer one of the most significant geopolitical events in South Asian history, the creation of Bangladesh from what had been East Pakistan. RAW provided training, weapons, intelligence support, and strategic guidance to the Mukti Bahini, the Bengali independence fighters resisting Pakistani military operations in East Pakistan in 1971. The Pakistani military's campaign against the Bengali population had included massacres of civilians on a scale that led to a refugee crisis of roughly 10 million people flooding into India. RAW's involvement transformed what might have been a prolonged civil war into a relatively swift military defeat of Pakistani forces. The operation worked. Bangladesh became an independent nation. Approximately 3 million people had died in the conflict, a number that remains politically contested, but is accepted by most historians and genocide scholars. RAW's role was not acknowledged for decades. Indian officials, when pressed, described India's intervention as humanitarian. The full scope of RAW's pre-war operations in East Pakistan, the agent networks, the training camps, the intelligence collection, has never been fully disclosed. RAW operates under no publicly available oversight legislation and has never been subjected to a parliamentary review of its operations. It does not officially exist in any statute. It was created by a Cabinet Secretariat resolution and has never been formalized in law. An intelligence agency operating without legal existence for over 50 years in the world's largest democracy. The CIA's Operation Condor, a continent-wide assassination program. In the 1970s, the intelligence services and military governments of 6 South American countries, Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay, formed a coordinated program to track, capture, torture, and kill political opponents across each other's borders. The program was called Operation Condor. The CIA provided training, logistical support, communications infrastructure, and, according to documents declassified in the 1990s, direct operational involvement. Under Operation Condor, political dissidents, union organizers, journalists, students, and in several cases sitting foreign officials, were disappeared across the continent. Suspects were extracted from one country to another without any legal process. Torture techniques were standardized and shared between participating agencies. Bodies were disposed of at sea from military aircraft, a practice known in Argentina as death flights. Approximately 60,000 people were killed under regimes connected to Operation Condor. Another 400,000 were imprisoned and tortured. In 2016, a Uruguayan judge convicted former Uruguayan and Argentinian officials for Condor related murders. In Argentina, several military officers were convicted in domestic courts. CIA officers who were present during torture sessions, whose names appear in declassified documents, have never been charged with anything. The cables showing American diplomatic officials receiving real time updates on disappearances were released under Freedom of Information requests. They are publicly available. The people named in them have retired comfortably. The modern FSB, the KGB, didn't die. It just got a new business card. In August 1999, an apartment building in the Russian city of Banatsk was bombed. Days later, apartment buildings in Moscow and Volgodonsk were bombed. Nearly 300 people were killed. The Russian government immediately blamed Chechen terrorists. Vladimir Putin, newly appointed as prime minister, promised to hunt the terrorists down. The bombings provided the political justification for the Second Chechen War and launched Putin's political career from obscurity to the presidency. In the city of Ryazan, local FSB officers and police discovered a bag in the basement of an apartment building containing what appeared to be a bomb. They evacuated the building. They called the FSB's central office in Moscow. The Moscow FSB told them the device was a training exercise, and the material in the bag was sugar, not hexogen explosive. The residents of the building found this explanation difficult to credit, given that the local FSB had called in a bomb disposal unit. A parliamentary investigation into the apartment bombings was proposed. Several people involved in the investigation died in unusual circumstances. The committee's work was largely obstructed. A former FSB officer named Alexander Litvinenko publicly accused the FSB of conducting the bombings as a false flag operation to justify the Chechen War. In 2006, Litvinenko was poisoned with polonium-210, a radioactive substance that can only be produced in state nuclear facilities in London. A British public inquiry concluded in 2016 that the murder was probably approved by Putin and the then director of the FSB. Russia denied everything. No extradition was processed. The two suspects identified by British investigators have continued to appear on Russian state television. One of them is now a member of the Russian parliament.